Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Word Balloon. This is John Suntress with an important plea for 2023. You probably read the headlines. Word Balloon took a sponsorship hit that was pretty significant, and I'm asking you if you've ever been a fan of Word Balloon and considered making a donation through Patreon, a very meager but important subscription. I hope you'll consider it. It's going to be a challenging 2023, and I need your help. So if you like Word Balloon, if you enjoy the content, I'm not going to slow down and keep bringing you some excellent content, but I could really use your help via Patreon, patreon.com/wordballoon. If you can afford the price of a comic book, if you can even afford $1 a month, it would be greatly appreciated and help the cause to keep Word Balloon going at the level and intensity that I've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years, and bring you a lot more content and a lot of great interviews and interesting things about the pop culture world. Patreon.com/wordballoon. I could really use your help. Thank you for your attention, your time, and listening to Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by AlexRossArt.com. Alex has been a longtime sponsor of Word Balloon. I greatly appreciate it. You got to go to his website. You will find tremendous art from original work, covers, pages, fantastic lithographs, amazing posters. Every price point is covered and every subject is covered at AlexRossArt.com. You've enjoyed his iconic looks at DC and Marvel, but also great stuff like his wonderful work on the Monkees, Monty Python, so many other great pop culture things that Alex has put his fingerprints on. His wonderful Flash Gordon poster that evokes the fantastic Dino De Laurentiis Sam Jones movie. Recently, Alex did things like the timeless Marvel covers featuring great solo shots of all your favorite Marvel heroes, and of course his Fantastic Four full circle graphic novel still available. All waiting for you now at AlexRossArt.com. Welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. We start with Vivek Tiwary, Broadway and film producer, who gives us all the facts behind his story, The Fifth Beatle from Dark Horse, the biographical graphic novel about Brian Epstien. We examine the social struggle of Epstein's double life as the manager who discovered the Beatles and as a secretly gay young Jewish man living in a 1960s anti-Semitic environment. Time to speak with Broadway producer and graphic novelist Vivek Tiwary about The Fifth Beatle from Dark Horse, which will also soon be a motion picture. In the conversation, we discussed the lack of Brian Epstein biographies, and I can't believe I forgot about his own authorized Cellar Full of Noise, which he co-wrote with ghostwriter Derek Taylor. Oh well, you can't remember everything. Here's Vivek Tiwary on Word Balloon. Vivek Tiwary, welcome to Word Balloon, and congratulations on The Fifth Beatle. It's an excellent book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you guys.
It was a wonderful project when I heard about it, and then hearing that you got Andrew Robinson and Kyle Baker to contribute on art only made it better. And when I've seen the end product, I mean, it's just fantastic. It's visually, I think, stunning and a great story. And I always consider myself a Beatles fan.
Thank you.
Absolutely, man. I consider myself a Beatles fan, but I've read The Love You Make, and I own the long 10-hour Beatles anthology, and
right on.
Absolutely, man. And I caught the tail end of the residue of Beatlemania and stuff. It certainly was a big part of my childhood, and I'm a longtime fan. Clearly, you're a longtime fan of the Beatles as well, I'm assuming.
I am. I grew up listening to the Beatles. My parents were avid Beatles fans, and quite literally played the Beatles while I was still in the womb. So you could say I've been listening to the Beatles since before I was born, actually. And incidentally, my parents also loved comics. So in a lot of ways, it all goes back to them, and it really is kind of bringing two of my great loves together. So this project really is a labor of love for me, and it's just it's so great to hear so many people responding to it so positively. It's a story I've wanted to share with the world for a long time. Andrew, Kyle, and I have been literally working on this book for about 6 or 7 years, and I've been researching Brian's story for about 21 years. So it's been a long time coming. It's very gratifying to have it finally be out there and to see people responding to it. It's a real joy.
Why did it make sense to do this as a graphic novel versus a traditional novel? I don't even know how many Brian Epstein biographies are out there, really.
Well, that's the first thing. There are none. I mean, The Fifth Beatle is the only book about Brian Epstein in print, graphic or otherwise. And while I was thinking about how I wanted to structure the story, as I said, I started researching his life about 21 years ago, but it was about 7 years ago that I decided to start working on it as both a graphic novel and incidentally as a film as well. We kind of have been developing both along similar tracks. Just the graphic novel took on a life of its own and really got completed, in advance of the film. But we really did think about the film from the early days as well. But when I first started thinking about the Fifth Beatle as a project and as a story I wanted to tell, if you will, for whatever reason, as a creator, it came into my head in terms of color palette. And I saw it, starting in 1961 Liverpool, which is very dark. It's gray, it's rainy, it's industrial, it's a little depressed. I saw it as being very black and white or very muted and monotone, if you will.
Absolutely.
And the story ends in 1967 London, which is, the birth of the psychedelic era. We're about to enter the summer of love. It really is a Technicolor dream, So in a lot of ways, this might sound awfully esoteric, but in my head, I saw the arc of the Brian Epstein story as matching the arc of the movement from black and white to color. And when you think of a story in such vivid color terms, to me that screamed graphic novel and film, which are in my opinion, the two most visual of the artistic mediums. And so that's kind of why I wanted to do it in those mediums. And that's a sort of a creative reason and maybe a little bit hard to understand. I hope it makes sense. But there's another sort of more practical reason, and that's I'm a huge fan of graphic novels and comics, and this is my first, and I've always wanted to do one. So there is that. And also, for lack of a more sophisticated word, I find the graphic novel medium to be very fun. It's a very fun. It's fun to read graphic novels.
Sure.
And this is a serious story. There's no question about that. It is not a comic book when you think of comic books. There's nothing comic about the Brian Epstein story, even though it's very lighthearted and fun in parts. However, I wanted people to experience this book and to pick it up and be able to breeze through it somewhat and to enjoy the experience. And I feel that a 128-page graphic novel could do that much more effectively than, say, a 300-page prose biography could. If I had written a 300-page book about Brian Epstein, a prose book, there might have been a few Beatles geeks like myself and maybe like you who would have enjoyed that book and who would have picked it up and plowed through it. But quite frankly, not nearly as many people as might pick up a 128-page graphic novel. You're kind of a Beatles fan. You take a look at the art and you see it's truly breathtaking work by Andrew and Kyle, and you think, it's not that long. I might give this book a shot. And to me, part of my goal with the Brian Epstein story was sharing this story with as many people as possible. And I don't mean that from a let's make as much money we can and sell more books standpoint. I mean it because, Brian's story, he's an unsung hero. And, everybody knows who the Beatles are, and I think everybody should know who Brian Epstein was. And so I wanted to put it into a medium that would be accessible. And I think the graphic novel medium is much more accessible than a prose biography would have been in this case.
And how about choosing your art team? What led you to Andrew and Kyle for this project?
Yeah, so I'd been a longtime comic fan, as I mentioned, but I'd never worked in the medium before. So I was familiar with artists, but didn't really know much about the process. And I was very lucky in that Andrew was one of the very first artists that I spoke to about working on the Fifth Beatle. And I knew Andrew through his work, and his work certainly speaks for itself. I mean, he's a fabulously talented artist, and so I knew that he would be amazing for the book from a talent standpoint. I knew that he'd be able to nail, the faces and the period and the architecture and all the elements that I was concerned about. So certainly I knew going into that conversation that from a talent side, Andrew is definitely the guy for the job. However, it was really getting to know Andrew as a person and getting a sense of the creative collaboration that we would have that really made it clear that he was the only guy for the job. And I come from a theater producing background. That's what I've done most of in the past 14 years. Mm-hmm. And theater production by its very nature is a very collaborative process. And so I guess I'm used to collaboration. And also I'm a people person. I love working with other people, and collaboration is really important to me. So I wanted an artist, and again, this was, being very honest and humble. This was my first book, and so I knew that I was going to want to work with somebody who'd be willing to be patient with me and would collaborate, and if I needed help, would be there for me. And so, I wanted an artist that, it is a subject I know very well and I'm very passionate about. So an artist who, on one hand, would be okay with me being very specific in my script and say, on this page I want 3 panels, and I want the panels laid out like this, and I want the camera angles to be like this, and I want the lighting to be like this, and I want the facial expressions to look like this, and here are 2 photo references, and here's a reference for the wardrobe that I want the characters to be wearing. Some pages were very detailed like that.
Okay.
And Andrew is somebody that was willing to give me that and had the talent to give me that. And as a quick aside, I'll say he's not an automaton. If he had an idea to do things differently, he would certainly tell me and we'd talk about it. But when I knew exactly what I wanted, he could give that to me, is basically what I'm getting at here. And then there were other sequences which were the exact opposite, where I knew the dialogue, and I knew what the characters were going through emotionally, and I knew the tone that I was looking for, but that's it. I would present him with those 3 things, and I would say, gosh, I don't know how to do this in sequential art. Can you help me out? And he said, great, here's some ideas. Here's how I think it should work. Here's a rough sketch of how I would lay it out. And then he would take the lead in those sequences. So, it really did run the gamut in that way, from being very specific in the script and being very vague in the script. And Andrew is somebody that was willing to do both, and to be very collaborative on both extremes. And that to me was really a godsend for the project. And, again, I'll just reiterate what I started by saying. He's also just a breathtakingly beautiful artist and just really nailed the work. So that's kind of how Andrew came to the project. Kyle is a New Yorker, and I'm a New Yorker, and we've known each other for years, and have always wanted to do something together. And the sequence that Kyle does for the book is a very short sequence that chronicles the band's time in the Philippines.
Yes.
And it pays homage to the old Beatles cartoons of the 1960s, the television cartoons.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I knew that I wanted that part of the book to feel almost like an insert, to be a radical shift in art style. So while I believe that Andrew is amazing and can really do anything, it was actually important for me to have another artist, to make it look so radical that there was a shift in artist at that point. And I knew I wanted a cartoonist, and Kyle is I think one of the world's great living cartoonists, and I knew him, and as I said, and wanted to do something with him, and I had a feeling, just knowing him the way I did, that he probably grew up listening to the Beatles, and he probably grew up with those cartoons. And so when I broached the idea with him, sure enough, he said, I loved those cartoons growing up. I'd love to do something that tips its hat to those cartoons. And then he read the script and realized that it was more than just a Beatles story, that it was a story about a really inspirational human story about the guy that was behind the band, as opposed to just being another Beatles story that we've heard 1,001 times. And so he loved the script and said, I'm in. And so I've been very lucky in that I've got 2 amazing artists working on it, and quite frankly, they really were the first 2 people that I went to, and they were both right, and it's been the end product is, again, I had nothing to do with the art, so I'm not patting myself on the back when I say this, but I think the end product from an artistic standpoint is truly breathtaking.
Absolutely. It's very cinematic. I believe that the palettes that they use, as you say, describe the various eras quite well. With Kyle's art, you get that kind of hectic and angst-ridden portion of the tour that the Beatles were going through when they went to the Philippines, and Beatles fans will know what I'm talking about, and I think that section is really great. And then, of course, really Brian's whole story, and it's an interesting, poignant year for this book to come out. I live in Illinois, and I'm glad to see that gay rights are being addressed in Illinois, and people are finally waking up to the idea that we should all be treated equally. And you look back, and I think you really lay out very obviously the amazing obstacles that Epstien had to contend with, being Jewish and gay 50 years ago, and how hostile society really was back then.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I'm so passionate about this subject. I'd like to say, very offhand, it's a story that should have been told 30 years ago. And certainly, in a very flippant way, that's true. However, really, it's a story whose time has come. Most of the research I did for this book was done through interviews, if only because, as I mentioned earlier, there are no books about Brian Epstein in print. And certainly when I began this study 21 years ago, there were also no online resources, no Wikipedia, no YouTube, none of these things. So I had no choice but to read Beatles books. And I'd read like a 400-page book about the Beatles, and I'd get maybe 10 good pages about Brian. And eventually I just put a portrait together in my head of who were the people that knew him best. And then I just started reaching out to them, and most of the book was done in that way, through interviews, and over the past 2 decades, many of those people became friends of mine, I'm very honored to say. And the truth is, nobody sort of said this to me in so many words, but it really felt to me that as the years progressed, these folks felt more and more comfortable talking about Brian, and it's really only been in the past 5 to 10 years that they would really open up to me about some of the stories surrounding Brian's homosexuality. And I think that's because the world is, we certainly have a long way to go still, but the world is far more tolerant than it was in the 1960s about homosexuality.
Absolutely.
At one period of time, for these people talking about their friend's sex life would have gotten him thrown in jail.
Yeah.
And then certainly after he died and the laws were repealed, talking about it might not have, had gotten their friend thrown in jail, but it was still not socially acceptable, and it was still taboo for them to talk about these things. And then the culture might have shifted a little bit, but there were still negative connotations about it. If they talked about Brian's homosexuality, it would almost be a negative stain coloring, his other accomplishments, so they wouldn't want to talk about it. And I think really it's only been, as I said, in the past 5 to 10 years that these folks are finally comfortable kind of opening up about that, because the world's willing to hear it. They're willing to hear the story about a gay man who overcame, prejudices against his sexuality to achieve a splendid dream, and to not have the starting point of the story be his homosexuality, and have that all of a sudden, negatively color anything else that you might hear that follows it. And so in a lot of ways, it really is a story whose time has come.
Understood. And, man, I'm telling you, I miss that as far as Brian's professional life, working for his father and having the record store as in MEMS. How do you say is in
MEMS, yeah.
I think I caught the tail end of that in terms of the importance of the local record store. We certainly shifted away from that era as well. And I think you guys do a great job of showing what it was like, the local interest in local bands, and how really just that demand for My Body kind of led Epstein to the Cavern Club and really discover the Beatles. That's a
a funny little anecdote about Brian's store, something we didn't get to spend too much time talking about in the book. But Brian's parents ran a furniture store, and he worked in their furniture store. Mm-hmm. And Brian had the idea that we should open a record division of the furniture store. And that sounds really random, but at the time, people went to furniture stores to buy their record players, because record players in the early 60s were these large pieces of furniture. So Brian had what at the time was a radical idea that, the place where you're going to buy your record player, you should also be able to buy your records. And obviously today the concept of sort of one-stop shopping and mega stores and that sort of thing is very common. But in the 1960s, that was kind of wacky that you would have put records in a furniture store. But the store was a tremendous success, and Brian instituted a policy that we will that at NEMS, at the music side of the furniture store, we will find any record for any customer at any time. If you have any request, we will track down the record and we will find it. And as you know from reading the book, that's how he found his way to the Beatles, because kids were coming in requesting the Beatles record, and he didn't readily have it. He said, "Why is it that I don't have it?" And it turned out it wasn't really a Beatles record. It was the Beatles as the backing band for a Tony Sheridan record. The record was on a German record label. It took a minute for him to track this down, but because he had this policy, he was like, "I'm going to track it down. I have a policy, and I have a commitment to my customers, and I'll track it down." And he did. and the record was sold really well, and he was like, who are these local guys that people are so interested in? And it was so hard to find their record, and finding out from an assistant that they played around the corner at the Cavern Club, he just had to go see them, and the rest is history, as they say.
You cover the book in three acts, basically, and in that early act, beyond the discovery of the Cavern Club, you learn a lot about how important record sales were to really the charts and get awareness of bands. And certainly, and I've heard this before, there's an excellent, I'm saying this for the listeners, you're likely aware of this, there's an excellent BBC 1-hour documentary about Love Me Do and everything that went into the production of Love Me Do. And I think you illustrate how active Brian was, kind of manipulating the numbers to make sure that Love Me Do kind of rose up to the charts as much as it could for that initial single.
Yeah, I started my company Tiwary Entertainment Group 14 years ago. But before that, I was working for record labels. The last place I was at Mercury Records for about 3 years.
Okay.
And was a division of Polygram. I had a wonderful experience there. But even then, which was, just 15 years ago, the sales positions and radio positions were incredibly important in breaking a new artist. Where you landed on that SoundScan chart, how many records you were selling every week, and how much you were being played on terrestrial radio was hugely important. And these days, I wouldn't say that it's unimportant, but the dynamics have shifted. It's a very different spectrum in how you break a local band. And to be quite honest, I'm not sure how you do it. But now their DIY has taken to a whole other level, and obviously there's the internet, and there are lots of ways for a band to build a following and build a career without necessarily saying I sold X number of CDs. I mean, how many people even buy CDs anymore?
Sure.
It's a very, very different time than when Brian was managing bands. But you're right. He ran a record store and he bought a lot of copies of the Beatles records. He had his store buy a lot of copies of the records to help manipulate those early sales numbers. He asked his parents and the store workers, please call the radio stations and request the Beatles songs. And these days that's business 101 inside a record label.
Sure.
There's all sorts of manipulating the charts as best you can within the realm of what's legal. Certainly,
Understood.
It's not illegal to get your friends to call the radio station. But in Brian's day, these were all trailblazing moves.
That's unbelievable, man. No, I being in the radio business and in both music and talk business, it really is. I think you captured that era quite well. And I'm thrilled that you got Billy J. Kramer to provide a forward, and I assume he's one of your interview subjects in terms of what Brian was like. So Billy J. Kramer of the Dakotas, Bad to Me, if people know their oldies and stuff, I think that might have been their biggest hit. So that's fantastic, and I'm sure Beatle fans love that too.
Yeah, I'll tell you a funny little anecdote about Billy J. Kramer. Billy, obviously he's had those wonderful hits that you just mentioned, but he also has worked quite regularly with Sandra Boynton. And for those of you who are parents in the audience, you will probably know that she is the author of many children's books that your kids may have read. And she wrote a book called The Going to Bed Book, which Billy J. Kramer narrates in that wonderful, deep Liverpool voice of his with that accent that I'm not even going to try to mimic. But I have a 5-year-old son, and my son knows Billy J. Kramer as the guy from the Going to Bed book.
Hilarious.
So when I was meeting Billy, I was like, I'm meeting Billy J. Kramer, and he goes, oh, from the Going to Bed book. And I said, yeah, I guess that's one way to look at him, And I think that's rather charming that my 5-year-old doesn't know him from Bad to Me and from Do You Want to Know a Secret? He knows him from the Going to Bed book, and I think there's something really lovely about that.
That's fantastic. And you do kind of provide beyond the Beatles, there are little shouts out to Billy J. and the Dakotas and Cilla Black as well. And,
sure, yeah,
his kind of group of young British talent that he was bringing over, starting with the Beatles. But, I mean, that's the thing. I really think you do a great job of showing who came up with the Beatle look. I mean, that it was Brian putting them in the suits and getting that haircut and everything, the signature haircut, and cleaning up these guys that had musically, been doing great as, basically a bar band in Germany and certainly in Liverpool, but really, kind of smartening them up and getting ready to present them to a much larger audience.
Yeah, Brian saw in the Beatles a group that had a great message of love to share with the world. And I know that sounds awfully cheesy, but I think that's what the Beatles really were all about. You know, all you need is love. She loves you, lovely Rita. I mean, so many of their songs were about love. And I think Brian saw that that was a worthy message. It was a beautiful message, and it was a universal message. And he believed that if he could package and present the Beatles properly, it was a message that the whole world would listen to. And I think as a gay man in the 1960s who to use another Beatles reference, had to hide his own love away, you know, being able to be a part of this group, you know, and a fifth member, if you will, you know, and help to bring that message of love into the world in his own way by presenting the band in a way that people could hear it. That was his dream. You know, he thought that the Beatles were going to be bigger than Elvis. And, you know, for a gay Jewish man running around Liverpool to say, I found a local band who's going to be bigger than Elvis, it was crazy. And people laughed at him, you know, but that was his dream, and he chased it, and he realized it in spectacular fashion. And I find that so incredibly inspiring. I really do. You know, he came up with the suits. He came up with the haircuts. He twisted Ed Sullivan's arm into booking a British band on the Ed Sullivan Show. And you have to, again, put this in context. A British band had never made a significant impact in the United States before the Beatles. You know, even though the Beatles at the time were a pretty successful UK act, Ed Sullivan, they had performed for the Queen of England. And as a result of that, Ed Sullivan thought they were a novelty group. You know, that was not impressive by United States standards. So it really, you know, I mean, people give Ed Sullivan a lot of credit, but the truth is, and you'll see this in the book, you know, Ed didn't want to book the Beatles. You know, he didn't think much of them. You know, obviously by the time they came over, they had a hit single, and Ed Sullivan looked like a genius. But the truth is, like, Brian had to twist his arm into booking the band, and Brian had that steadfast faith in the Beatles that again, if he could present them in the right way, the whole world would embrace their message, and that they would be bigger than Elvis, and that they would spread a whole lot of love into the world. And I think as a gay man in the 1960s, that was a dream that he felt worth fighting for.
Understood. And there's a Chicago connection to that difficulty in breaking into the American markets, because even though Capitol Records here in America was owned by EMI, and I believe EMI was obviously based in England, they couldn't convince the Capitol guys to release the American songs. So Brian and the band would go to these independent labels in the States to release some of those early records, among them Swan Records.
That's exactly right.
And Swan was based here in Chicago. So there's Chicago record stores are still in a good way littered with some of those early singles and
that is awesome.
And albums and stuff. Awesome. Yeah. Oh no, some of my friends that are big record collectors.
You know, no UK record label wanted to sign the Beatles, and then they did, and they were successful in the UK. And then Brian went through the whole thing all over again because the US labels didn't want to take them. You know, it was every, you know, I mean, we know the Beatles story, and we've seen their meteoric rise to international superstardom, and you know, the band were together less than 10 years, so it really was like a moving freight train, and it was rather meteoric. And as a result of that, you know, when we hear the Beatles history, you don't really stop and see that all the struggle points. And the Brian Epstien story is a chronology of those struggle points. And not just remarkable how he achieved all this business success, but it's an inspiring human story to know that he did that during a time where he was gay, and it was against the law to be gay. He was Jewish, and anti-Semitism was rampant.
You bet.
And he was from Liverpool at a time where that town had no cultural influence. It really is unbelievable what he accomplished, both professionally and personally.
There's this footage at I forget what concert it is, and likely you might know, where they cut to Brian, and he looks kind of always concerned. It always seemed like Brian was sad and didn't have the opportunity to truly enjoy the success because of all of these restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, it's the restrictions. It's also the pressures he put on himself. You know, I also think that he viewed the Beatles as a little bit. No, this isn't an entirely perfect analogy, but to some degree, they were the children that he would never have. You know, he loved them like a father loves a son, and had big dreams for his son and sons, and big ambitions for them, and nothing was good enough. You know, as many parents will relate to that feeling. And so there was a side of Brian that I mean, it is an inspiring story, but a tragic story. He dies at the age of 32,
yes.
sort of in many ways crushed by his ambitions and the pressures that he put on himself as a result of that. He realizes this wonderful dream and yet dies lonely at the age of 32, never having had a proper boyfriend.
Yeah.
So there is a deep tragedy to the Brian Epstein story, but I think, throughout that sadness is this overwhelming sense of accomplishment and hope and dreams come true, and that's why I found the story so inspiring, despite the tragedy and despite all the struggles and the pressures that he put on himself, and the darker side to the story. And as I said earlier, it is a serious story. It is not a comic book.
No.
It's a very serious piece of work, and there's a lot about the Brian Epstein story that is dark and sad and cautionary. But at the end of the day, I hope that I've left my readers with a real sense of hope and a sense of inspiration.
I think absolutely. And he opened the doors that the Beatles walked through, and that can't be denied. The fact that this isn't a pure documentary per se, and I think a lot of times when people, and I'm sure when the film comes out, there'll be these questions as well. The level of artistic license versus telling the facts as best as you're able to gather them and stuff. How much do you think, there are some obvious metaphors that you play with that I think are really great and really do illustrate a likely feeling. But yeah, that kind of artistic license, you know where I'm getting at in terms of how much
I do. Yeah. It's a very interesting thing. The graphic novel biography is a fascinating subsection of graphic novels, and
Sure.
we're certainly not the first, and there are a few others, but we're a small and growing group of graphic novels. And, I feel like the graphic novel biography sort of falls somewhere between a prose biography and a film. With prose biographies, readers expect that has to be the facts. Mm-hmm. You can't have artistic license in a prose biography. It needs to be, the letter of the law. It needs to be what happens, and that's the whole point of a prose biography. And with a film, I think viewers allow the filmmakers a tremendous amount of artistic license. If you've seen Walk the Line and later find out that, Johnny Cash didn't propose, on stage, in the middle of a concert,
Sure.
I don't think anyone is really upset about that. You sort of get, that's okay because it's a Hollywood moment, and it also sort of points out the passion and how he really had to kind of, lay his soul bare in front of the world in order to propose to her. It captures the poetry behind the moment, and it's a film, whatever the case. It's a Hollywood moment. That's fine. I think that's the general response to something like that. And I feel like a graphic novel falls somewhere in the middle. Because it is still a book. And people, it's like, people said to some degree you got to believe what you read, or don't believe everything you read, sort of implicit in that warning
Sure.
is that people do really believe what they read, and so in a book, you have to have some degree of the truth or a large degree of the truth, People expect if it's a graphic biography, it's that the biographer is going to take that biography part pretty seriously. But we are allowed some artistic license. It is also expected that it's told through art, through sequential art. And art, in my opinion, is about poetry. And I think the readers allow and expect, really, a degree of poetry in the telling. If not, they'll track down a prose biography,
Absolutely.
So I feel like we do take some artistic licenses, and I have been studying the facts for about 21 years, as I mentioned, and I'm happy to say that just about everything that happens in the Fifth Beatle actually happened. The only thing that we totally made up is and it's not far off from the Johnny Cash analogy, is that there's a scene where Brian gets blackmailed at a live television interview,
Yes.
And that actually happened, but it happened at a party. That character did show up in London out of the blue and blackmailed Brian in public, but it wasn't during a television interview. I just thought that showed the pressure, the crushing pressures of the moment in a little bit more dramatic fashion and worked better for the narrative. So I thought it was okay to do that. But that's the only thing that's actually 100% made up. And there's the character of Moxie, which I don't want to talk too much about because I'd like our readers to kind of discover her and you could kind of figure out for yourself what's going on there. But everything that Moxie does is based in historical fact, And the book really does take its biographical moments quite seriously. But, it also, I wrote about this a little bit in the afterword to the book. My goal here was less about presenting to the world a litany of facts, and more trying to capture the poetry of the Brian Epstein story, to really portray, who was this man and what made him tick, and what is his legacy all about? What is the inspiring factor of Brian's story that we can continue to learn and live and be inspired by? That kind of poetry, that's what I was more interested in telling than in just chronicling the facts of the guy who managed the Beatles. To me, that latter idea, that's less interesting. It's important. So, and that's why I take my facts and my very seriously. And Andrew, Kyle, and I took the facts and down to the architecture and the wardrobe and the all of that kind of stuff. That's the type of cars that they were driving. All of that. So if we took that very seriously, because I think the facts are important. But more important than that, to me, in telling the fifth Beatles story and telling the Brian Epstein story, is the poetry, and some artistic license is necessary if you're gonna capture poetry.
Absolutely, considering, too, that music is such a big part of this story, and you're dealing with a silent medium. So I think that's interesting as well. And again, I really do think with the colors and the images, you do get to paint this world quite accurately based on what I've read, and still tell this very lyric story. The Beatles themselves, the living Beatles, are they aware of the project? What participation or even awareness?
Yeah, they are. One of the very first things I did when I started working on this project was I contacted all of them, meaning Paul, Ringo, and the estates of John and George, so
Okay.
Yoko and Olivia Harrison.
Okay.
I let them know I was working on this project, and I kept them posted over the years. And as the film development got more knee deep into it, the very exciting news about the film, or one of the very exciting pieces of news about the film, is that we have access to Beatles music. And in order to get that access, we had to get the sign off on the script by the four players, by Paul, Ringo, Yoko Ono, and Olivia Harrison. And that word came down through Apple Corps, through the Beatles company, that they did approve the script. And so they are very well familiar with the story and how we're telling it, and so familiar that they approved my project and allowed me to do a deal with Sony ATV, who control the Lennon-McCartney music catalog. And that's a long-winded way of saying I have unprecedented access to Beatles music for the film. We are literally the first and only film about the band in history to have gotten their approvals and to have gotten those music rights.
Wow.
So we're very, very proud of that. And additionally, it was revealed at New York Comic Con on our panel. Dave Marsh, who moderated that panel, made the announcement. He revealed to the world that Paul McCartney is, in fact, a big fan and supporter of this book. I call him a silent supporter, which means, we're not plastering his quotes everywhere, but he has read the book and loved it and wrote me a very lovely note saying so. That he really liked the way that we did it, and he commented on the artwork, and he is actually a longtime comic book fan, so it's not it's not totally surprising that he would be very particular about his comic book notes, but he is definitely a supporter of this project, and I'm very, very proud to say that. Dave Marsh, who's a famous pop critic, literally gave Paul a copy of the book when he was doing interviews for his new album. He was interviewing with Dave, and Dave gave him a copy of the book, and he said, "I've already read this, and I love it. It's wonderful." And so it's very gratifying to know that he is a supporter of the project.
That's terrific, man. I was going to mention the two movies that I'm aware of, certainly Backbeat, but I remember that Dick Clark television movie, Birth of the Beatles, as well.
Yeah.
And, it's fantastic, because I was wondering if there might be any sort of, obviously for the film, but even for the graphic novel, any sort of complimentary music supplement, or even if you're able to, and I don't know if you've already done this, recommended songs for certain passages.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I have thought about putting a recommended playlist together and posting it online of songs that I suggest you listen to while you're reading the book.
Yeah, man.
And by the way, not all of them are Beatles songs, and not all of them are even period songs. In much the same way that I'm trying to trying to convey the poetry of the Brian Epstein story. Like, there's certainly moments where I would suggest you listen to Hard Day's Night and the Kyle Baker sequence. In the script, I gave him Help as a music cue. I was like, imagine this being set to Help. But there are also moments of the script that I think, that I heard, in my mind, I heard, Bauhaus's All We Ever Wanted Was Everything.
Cool.
That to me is a song that fits quite well with the Brian Epstein story. So I have been thinking of putting a playlist together that includes Beatles songs, period songs from the 60s, and also more modern songs that may have been influenced by the Beatles and Brian's work, like the Bauhaus track, for example.
That's excellent.
So yeah, stay tuned, and I do hope to get around to posting something like that fairly soon. But I'm very proud to report that the film will have Beatles music in it. And the other piece of news on the film that I'd like to take a moment to share,
please, absolutely.
We announced last week that Peyton Reed will be directing. Peyton is amazing. He is incredibly passionate about this project. He directed Bring It On, Yes Man, and The Breakup.
Okay.
And his films are all films that on the surface, are very fun and entertaining, much the way the Beatles were. But if you look a little bit deeper below the surface, there are also films that take very seriously their exploration of the human condition. They're about striving for accomplishment and ambition. They're about the drive to love and be loved. And that really is the heart of the Brian Epstein story. And Peyton's also a music guy. He directed videos for Superchunk, and he just is almost as passionate about the story as I am myself. And so he could not be more perfect a choice for the fifth Beatle. So we're very, very proud to have him on board, and we are going to be looking to cast our Brian Epstein now, and I hope to have an announcement to make on that early in the new year.
Excellent.
So it's very, very exciting times for the fifth Beatle.
All right, my vote is for Colin Firth, although he might be a little too old at this point.
Yeah, Brian was 32 when he died. Colin is an amazing actor, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure if his age would allow him to play the role. I feel like if I've got 2 hours to tell the Brian Epstein story, and part of the story is how young he was and how much he accomplished at such a young age. You definitely want people to be able to see the youth in the character. Which is not to say that Colin is an old man. He's certainly not, but. If you want, I don't know if you can do early 20s, put it that way.
I get it, man, and you're right. I'm thinking more Bridget Jones Colin Firth than King's Speech Colin Firth.
Yeah,
Shame
sure.
on me. But yeah, absolutely, man. And a lot of times these movies are kind of locked down even before production begins as far as, all right, we need it done by X. As far as, like you say, you're just casting right now. So are you still looking for a major distributor, or is there a major studio involved already, or...
There's a major producer involved. My co-producer on the project is Bruce Cohen.
Cool.
Bruce has won the Academy Award for American Beauty and was nominated for the award 2 other times for Milk and for Silver Linings Playbook.
Wow.
And Bruce also produced Big Fish for Tim Burton.
Absolutely.
So Bruce is an incredibly well-respected filmmaker. And he, if you've read the book, you'll know that the DNA of the Fifth Beatle really is in all of those films. We've got sort of the whimsy and the fantastical sequences that you'll see in something like Big Fish.
You bet.
We have the importance of gay rights issues that you'll find in Milk, and we have the sense of pathos and the human condition and family issues and sort of personal struggles that you'll see in films like American Beauty and Silver Linings Playbook. So Bruce really is perfect for the project, and he was on a New York Comic-Con panel with me, and I'll quote him. He said, he also added, I'm not from Liverpool, but I am gay and I am Jewish. So the Brian Epstein story is very personal for Bruce as well. And right now Bruce and I are putting the film together independently because we feel we can, but we're not ruling out possibly partnering with a studio down the line. So we'll see how that plays itself out. But right now we've attached our director, and our next goal is to attach our actor. And after that, we'll start thinking about whether a studio makes sense.
Understood. And right now, too, the focus is the book came out in November, and it's excellent. Congratulations on making the New York Times bestseller list.
Thank you.
Well deserved. And this is a tremendous book. And as you say, graphic novel biographies are a smaller sliver genre within the world of comics, but this is really terrific, and
Thank you.
Absolutely, man. I highly recommend it to Beatle fans and comic readers and people curious about this portion of the Beatles story that has been so underserved for so long. So yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for making the awareness of this.
Thank you so much,
and for producing such a great book. Absolutely, man, and continued success. And really, I look forward to the movie, and maybe before the movie is ready, you'll come back and we'll preview the movie as well.
I would love to. And in the meanwhile, if people do want sort of breaking information about the book there and the film, because there is news coming in fairly fast and furious, we do have a very robust website at fifthbeatle.com. We're on Facebook as the Fifth Beatle, and we're on Twitter at Fifth Beatle. And I'm also on Twitter personally at Vivek J. Tiwary. And so through any of those mechanisms, you can get the latest and greatest breaking news on the film. And really, if you've been following us over the past month, you'll know that I'm not kidding when I say the announcements really have been flowing very fast and furious. And so I would really love for any of your listeners to start following us and to start hearing the news, because there's going to be quite a bit of it in the next few months. And 2014 is going to be a very big year for this book and this film. So thank you for your interest in it.
There you go, Vivek Tiwary from 2013 discussing the Fifth Beatle. I wonder what's happening with the movie adaptation of Vivek's graphic novel about Brian Epstein. I don't know. It's been 10 years. Maybe it's time for a new conversation with Vivek and see what's going on. But again, this is one of those great books that you really do deserve to go back if you've never read it before. It's a great depiction of Brian Epstein's personal struggle in his dual life. So I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Tonight on Word Balloon Live, I'll be talking to Matthew Rosenberg about a lot of his current comics, not only his independent books, but certainly the great work he's been doing lately for DC. I hope you'll join us for that. Later this week on Wednesday, I'll have Tom King back for a new edition of The King's Speech, and we'll be talking about The Human Target and Danger Street and Gotham City Year One, all fantastic books from Tom. Love Everlasting, also his wonderful book with Elsa Chartier, is the first trade is going to be out in just a couple weeks, so we're going to be talking about that, and of course taking your questions. So that's all happening Wednesday night here on Word Balloon Live. Nice way to usher in February here on Word Balloon. But in these closing days of January, I hope you've enjoyed this month's programming. Again, Word Balloon brought to you by the League of Word Balloon Listeners. Their wonderful support via Patreon, patreon.com/wordballoon. Everyone's been incredibly kind, and I appreciate the efforts by the Word Balloon listeners to kind of come to my aid after having a big drop of sponsorship money and participation. And listen, I'm not asking for a lot. If you can help out the cause here at Word Balloon and help me with a subscription, either $1 a month, the price of a comic, whatever you can spare would be greatly appreciated. And I really hope you enjoy the level of conversation that I bring to Word Balloon on every episode. So thank you as always. If you want, go to patreon.com/wordballoon. That's the place to sign up for your subscription. But thank you very much, League of Word Balloon listeners. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2023. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy.